Hello everyone. I didn't intend this to be performative, but when you have the kind of hair that I have, working with a microphone always becomes a bit of a drag. And I wanted to start with thanking the organization for flying me in, because I, like Andreas, I'm going to start with a series of disclaimers and maybe blame some other people as well. I regret that I haven't been here yesterday, but I was tied up, as the organizers knew. But it also puts me in a bit of a precarious situation. So I start with a slight hesitation. I have no idea what you have been talking about yesterday. So I might overlap or say irrelevant things where you immediately think like, well, this has been said before, we extensively discussed it. So I'd like to invite you to raise your hand and immediately brutally interrupt me when that is the case, so that I'm not talking blah, blah, blah in front of you. And the other disclaimer has more to do, it's a kind of permanent disclaimer. I am very bad with PowerPoint. It's kind of impossible to still be that way in 2016, and I'm not that old that I shouldn't be able to manage. It's also the first time that I have an assistant, and my assistant and I are not on the same level yet because she made this presentation and left half out. So please just consider it as visual wallpaper. It's better, you can look at it rather than looking at me. But it is related, but it won't give you an illustration of what I tried to talk about today. So I was very impressed by the presentation of Counterspace, and it also leads me to say that I speak from a mainstream institutional perspective. My current job is a very official one. I run a museum for contemporary art and for old art, 16th and 17th century. It's a bit what you can see suggested in the background. We have a collection of 17th century Dutch art, and we have a collection of contemporary art spread over 2 buildings. That will not really come into play, but I think it's important to state this, that I speak also, and I'm very happy to mention it, from a position of where I think that the curator is always interdependent. That's something like autonomy, where independence is a total illusion. And that's not a cynical statement, it's also not a kind of sadistic one. It's just, I think, assuming a certain realism in how we are always in this quadrangular relationship of speaking as a curator-director, being in quadrangular relationship with the institution, with the audience, and with the artist. So we're never free, and we're always in a kind of position of subservience, a positive one, albeit. And I continue my disclaimers, and then I'll stop. One other disclaimer is that I'm not sure whether you discussed the fact that in the recent past there's been a number of initiatives dealing with curatorial ethics that have tried to plow through before coming here. One of them is the performance continues with my clumsiness. One of them is Moose Magazine number 34. One of the curatorial questions posed there was, what is responsibility? And in the essay that engendered out of it, Peter Ely, who's a curator at PS1 MoMA, tries to kind of navigate that very murky field, where he actually claims that we are in a field, an art field that has no regulations. And he also claims that maybe we should not talk about curatorial ethics, we should talk about bad behavior in curating. We should make a distinction between bad curatorial behavior and plain bad curating. And then the ethical question only comes into play when you talk about bad curatorial behavior. And another event that you might have been discussing is the conference on curatorial ethics that took place in Kunsthalle Vienna in 2015. I tried to watch it online. It's a humongous amount of information and non-information, but one of the things that really struck me there is that nobody tried to define what ethics actually are, or what codes we do have in the art world. It also made me realize that I am not familiar with the existing written codes that are present. So a bit of seminal research led me to 2 things. One is that already in 1925, the American Alliance of Museums was the first to publish a professional code that described the ethics of the museum. Not of the individual curator, also not of the curator working within an institutional context, but of the museum and institution as such. And according to AAM, ethics are very well-founded principles that help people make the right choices or the right decisions. And they also claim that acting ethically means adopting behaviors that, if they are universal, lead to the best possible result for the largest amount of people. So it's essentially ethical behavior defined as compromise. It's supposed to be for the benefit of as large group or groups of people as possible. And they also stress that acting ethically is different from acting lawfully. We're all supposed to act lawfully. Acting ethically is a choice. You might also very reasonably decide to act unethically and not be put on a stance for that. You're probably thinking, where does this lead us? But for me, it was very important to look at those codes. There's two that I looked at. One is the AAM, and the other one is from CIMAM. And there's one from the Curators Committee of the American Association of Museums. They're all pretty succinct, maximum 10 pages. You can read them. But it was very striking, what is incredibly striking about them, that in all of these, also the curator's ethics, there's no mention of the artist. There's also no mention of intellectual integrity. There's mention of financial possible implications of unrightful collecting, of how your personal collecting might go against the collecting of the institution, but nothing about intellectual integrity, nothing about the relationship with the artist. And not even in, I think you are probably familiar with the Code of Ethics published by the Guerrilla Girls in 1989. Even they don't mention anything about the curator's relationship with the artist, apart from one passage that reads in fictitious Old English, a curator shall not exhibit an artist or the artist of a dealer with whom he or she has had a sexual relationship, unless such liaison is explicitly stated on a wall label 8 inches from the exhibited work. I've never seen that happen, but I thought it was striking. Like if we talk about ethics in the official museum field, then apparently the artist is not a player, or it's just an irrelevant kind of button that you push around. And it's also talking about ethics immediately, and that will explain why I will talk about a case study that relates to me, not because I'm so terribly egocentric or narcissistic, because talking about ethics and pointing at the other is a very complicated situation. You might also have leafed through, while coming to this conference, an issue of the Manifesta Journal on ethics, issue number 12, and as you know, Manifesta has some ethical issues, a large number of them. Nevertheless, in the whole publication, there is no mention of ethical entanglements that Manifesta might be in. It tries to discuss the topic objectively, and I don't believe in that. I think if we talk ethics, we have to talk about what we do ourselves on a daily basis. On the other hand, one of the articles that I recommend that you read in the Manifesta Ethics issue is by Dieter Roelstraete, who, like one of the other writers that I actually don't know, Miguel Hernández Navarro, says like, well, ethics should not be about discourse, it should be about action. And Roelstraete asks himself, like, do curatorial ethics as such, does that exist, or is it just in the doing? Very complicated question, and I hope we'll also address in the panel, like, do we need this meta level, or should we just enact or embody or perform ethical behavior? And in order, you probably wonder what this image is. I'll come to that. There's other more kind of nondescript images. Oh, the same one. In a strange layout. I'll put it to one that is possibly calming. No, this is not calming. Maybe this. Is this calm enough? Maybe this is calmer. What I wanted to talk to you about, or what I wanted to use as a starting point, and my hair is really annoying me, is my own experience with 2 exhibitions where I felt that I failed as a curator. Because I think that talking about ethics as a practicing curator, that kind of ethics only become apparent when you actually fail, when there's a moment of crisis. Marianne talked very inspiringly about happy artists. Actually, ethics come into play when the artist is not happy, when the institution is not happy, when the media pursue you, when there's a situation of conflict where you, as a curator, are a kind of lynching pin. And when I was director of the OBL, that was actually one of the topics that we discussed most often with the participants. Not necessarily this crisis, but more like, what is ethical behavior as a curator, and can we predict that? Can we sort of foresee when ethics come into play in a crisis situation? And do we actually have rules that we share on how you deal with artists, how you build your relationship? One of the discussions we very often had is kind of the opposition, you could say, or how I always formulated it, is that you have between inductive and deductive curating. I don't know how many of you have studied maths, very simplistic maths. Inductive is like different points condensed into one. Deductive is one point and then going to different statements. This opposition between, let's say, deductive curating, you have a theme, a proposition, a message as a curator, and then you derive artists from that. You pick your theme and you have artists that illustrate that or who interact with that theme. Inductive curating is the opposite. You're interested in a number of artistic positions, and then you come to a certain kind of proposition or story you might tell. And the discussions we very often had with the students of the Appel was that, I should have drawn this, I promise. If you see me next time, I'll be a better user of PowerPoint. That deductive curating was evil, unethical, because it reduced the artist to somebody who illustrates the statement of the curator. And inductive curating was hyper-ethical because it had a dialogue with the artist, and actually it put the curator on a more submissive level of like, I am inspired by the artist, and everything I have to say about the world, about the art world, about art, about the sense of being, is derivative from the position of the artist. I'm saying that because I think that plays a role also in how we look at ethical behavior towards artists. I personally believe in a third way. I think that interesting exhibitions in which interesting relationships with artists are engendered are a mixture of inductive and deductive. But it doesn't explain my double failure. And the double failure I want to go into relates in the first place to this image. I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of breath. You will interrupt me when I say something you've already heard repeatedly, right? Promise? Okay. These are images of an exhibition that never happened in the Appel in 2007, I think. I'm very bad at chronology too. It was a solo show by the German artist Thomas Hirschhorn that was closed down before it even was totally installed. And the reason for that closure is so incredibly complicated that even after a number of years, I can't really pinpoint it. I recently was at a joint dinner with Thomas Hirschhorn in Basel, of all places, where we both tried to look back at this episode. We reconciled, we had a huge fight, we reconciled, and none of us could really pinpoint what had happened. But if I give you a brief sketch, and then I'll talk about the failure, I had vaguely known Thomas Hirschhorn before we engendered on, or we came to the common decision to make a solo show of his at the Appel. He was at that moment in time in a very deep personal crisis with different entanglements. I was familiar with his work, not so much with him as a person, and he decided, to my great joy, to make a completely new piece for the Appel, where he also would stage something that he had never tried before, namely a live performance with his band, and the whole show was actually a stage for that performance. So it was also, in a way, an attempt to transgress his own limits as an artist. When Thomas arrived with the whole crew in the Appel to install, a discussion ensued on, and there I'm going to do the unrightful thing of blaming my assistant that she didn't include the image, but she probably didn't have it, on the invitation card. The invitation card series we had at that moment in time were designed by Will Holler, a British-Dutch conceptual designer, and they had the format or appearance of a rebus. Is that an English word? Rebus, leading to the title of the exhibition, White Dada. And 2 days before the opening, Thomas said that he could not live with that image, that it was insulting, that he felt it undermined his practice, and that he could not go on with the show. We had 2 more nights of booze-infused discussion, of mutual impotence, and in the end, the show did not open. And we issued a collective statement, and that was a really interesting one, because it One of the other things that is kind of prominent in the Manifesta Journal is that they start with a bon mot by Pierre Restani, saying like, curating is an act of compromise. This closure of the show was definitely an act of compromise. Thomas Hirschhorn didn't want to blame the institution for being offended. He didn't want to make a statement. We didn't want to make a statement saying like, what the fuck, which professional artist shuts down a show 2 days before the opening because of an invite that he saw beforehand. So we decided to engage in mutual compromise and actually not talk about this at all. And this statement was issued saying, the artist, due to personal reasons, cannot open the show. Nobody talked about it, no media appearance, nothing whatsoever. And I think that was the biggest kind of surprise, because we prepared for a catastrophe on both sides. Nothing happened. Why do I mention this? Because it's quite uneventful and it's also quite personal. I mean, I don't know what happened with Thomas Hirschhorn at that moment. He couldn't really figure out what I wanted with forcing to maybe open the show. I say because I think curating is also part emotional labor. And where I felt that I failed is that I did a show with an artist that I didn't know well enough in order to actually work with so extensively. To engage in a new production, I think it's ethical to also get to know each other intensely well, because you might avoid problems of misunderstanding. And I hope, I obviously made it like, I assume that I'm going over time. I still have a lot to say, but I think this point of curating as emotional labor and as that having ethical implications is something I would like put out there in the room. Apart from being professional, as curators, I think we also have a personal obligation to engage very deeply with someone before engaging in a solo show. That leads me to the second example that I have no images of, but I'm sure you can find them online. That is a show I did with Bjarne Melgaard, a Norwegian artist in a newly established institution, Martha Herford, in Germany. And the show, called Black Low, Punks Are Just Hippies with Short Hair, engaged with the aesthetics of black metal, its entanglement with Satanism and Scandinavian mythology, and took the form of a performance and a multifaceted exhibition in a cellar space. My relationship with Bjarne Melgaard is the opposite. I've known Bjarne for many, many years, went through many, many highs and lows. I think I can draw him inside out, if ever that is possible. At that point, we thought that we were hitting upon a great exhibition, because the theme of black metal in that particular region of Germany is alive and kicking. It's a region where you have black metal discos galore, where Satanism is a topic of conversation. So we thought like this is Bjarne's personal obsession matches very well with the setting. We also realized that what he was trying to do in the performance, which would kind of flirt with SM practices and with black metal aesthetics, would possibly be illegal. So the probably wrong decision I took was to organize a session with legal representatives of the police, of youth criminality, of the fire brigade, of youth protection, to inform them about the performance and ask whether or not we were actually not being unethical, but illegal. It turned out that we were not, but it was the worst, I think, bad curatorial decision I could have made, because I was not aware of actually the local structure of how people relate. 5 minutes, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I have to shorten this. The fact was that all these professional people went home, went to the bar, started talking about the performance, so the snowball got rolling before the thing ever happened. Consequently, the German Oberstaatsanwalt Düsseldorf charged us with breaching paragraph number 131 of the German law, which is, the offense was defined as a depraved representation of violence. And they left us a choice: you either close the show yourself or we're going to sue you. And I myself and the director Jan, who decided not to close the show, but we were overruled by the general director, who said that we had no legal authority to breach the law, because we were not German citizens, and he was the embodiment of the institution being a German citizen. What ensued is a whole cascade of legal implications. In the end, the offence was deemed not happening, so we were cleared of prosecution. The catalogue is still on the blacklist, and we could reopen the show. But that felt as total failure, because both Bjarne and I realized that we were trying to tap into a sort of local sensitivity, and that's where we failed. Despite the whole cascade of being right in a legal way, we were incredibly wrong in being culturally or contextually sensitive. Those questions still bother me today on a very personal level, like was I wrong in exploring the legal consequences? Was I wrong in not being sensitive enough to the local cultural ecology of how people relate to each other? Was I too lenient towards the artist? Because in the end, both Bjarne and I conclude that his show was actually not very good, that it was one that you would rather remove out of the CV, well, not because of the whole judicial battle, but just because of the quality of what was being shown. Or was I not critical enough towards the artist? Should I have resigned? All those things still sort of play a role. And that leads me to suggest, because I had a suggestion and a question for today, that yes, as a cultural sector, we should work towards a very active ethics, curatorial ethics, that we write down in the form of a manifesto, or that we not construct within the framework of a legal body such as CIMAM or the American Alliance of Museums. Maybe it should be done by IKT, or that we keep this discussion that you've engendered here now alive, and that it has some condensation in an inspirational document. Not in a document that is restrictive, not in a document that is normative or a regulation, but an inspirational one, as an aspirational one that sets kind of ambitions and aspirations rather than limitations. And Alex Farquharson made a very good attempt at doing so, I think, in a conference that the Comité van Roosendaal, of which the Appel was a part, organized in 2010, called Institutional Attitudes. In his paper for that, he kind of lists how, speaking from an institutional perspective, how as a curator within a mainstream institution, you can actually behave ethically while taking into account all the pressure that is being put on you in an economical, political, and media sense. And I have to really make this quicker than I would like to. A few bullet points that I think that we can take from Alex are hospitality. It seems like a cliche. He says, like, be hospitable towards your audiences, be hospitable towards the artist. Think in multiplicities. Don't just think from one position, and think continuously with hospitality in mind. Generosity. He also claims that good ethical behavior as a curator, as an institution, means that you extend your approach, your generous and hospitable approach, to spaces that are beyond the physical spaces where you show art. And give people access to the resources of institutions. Put at people's disposal the backstory, the research tools that can give people more make them more informed about the build-up or the genesis of a certain project. And he concludes by saying, say yes, which I think is particularly relevant for this conference. He literally says, I quote, try to say yes to political or public expectations whenever you can, but convert these agendas to something more radical and unexpected. He basically says, as mainstream institutions, we should not try to resist the whole impossible ukases from national governments on visitor numbers, on reaching broader audiences, on trying to be as accessible as possible. He says, like, embrace that, but then turn it around. And that's exactly, I think, what he has done at Nottingham Contemporary. Embrace all those impossible targets that government puts upon you, but just pervert them or subvert them by performing them differently. And I think that we should add to that, to the pointers that Alex Farquharson gives us indirectly. Also, say yes, but also learn to say no. Learn to say no to political bodies, but also learn to say no to artists. As a curator, you also embody the institutional framework that you probably endorse. Otherwise, you wouldn't be working there. Try to mediate that position and try to make clear why certain limitations are necessary for a public connection between art and its audiences, and not necessarily always a restriction. And I wanted to add an epilogue to that, which was more my question. I'm trying to think how I could summarize 4 pages into 1 minute. Anybody else, any suggestion? How to do that? Because I said I started from myself, because I think talking about ethics in the curatorial field, if you talk about other case studies that you're not involved in, it very easily becomes pointing the finger. It becomes morally righteous. It becomes a very confused zone between criticality and righteousness. And a recent example for me was, and it's something that we might take to the panel, or maybe it's too specific, the whole controversy surrounding the closure, reopening of the exhibition, The Sovereign and the Beast at MAGBA, where Bartolomeo Mari, the general director, first wanted to close down an exhibition before it started, when there was a general appraisal or refusal from the art world. He reopened it. He consequently resigned because of his own kind of paradoxical position, but forced the board to also fire the two curators who were in charge of the exhibition. Next to that, what happened is that the Internationale, the collective that he's part of, first issued a letter of support saying we understand his predicament, we fully endorse his decision. And a few months later, the same people who are part of the Internationale, Vassif Kortun, Charles Esche, and Abdullah Karoum, officially resigned from the board of CIMAM, the museum institution, because they could no longer see or agree with a general director, Bartolomeo Mari, who's also the director of the board of CIMAM, who cannot defend ethical standards. I think these kind of cases that go beyond individual failure are so complex, and if we want to discuss them, I do think that we need something, our variety of the Hague Tribunal. That sounds very heavy and very unnecessary, but I think the discussions that go around such a big case that are so important for all of us, because it's clearly, you can only be judgmental about it, can never transgress beyond personal ideology or even maybe entanglement of personal preferences if you don't create a body where those issues are discussed. And a kind of mock version of that was set up in 2007. Some of you might know the sort of staged conceptual trial organized by Anton Vidokle after the closing down of Manifesta 6, which was a trial in which the curators were put on trial with a judge, prosecutors, legal attorneys. It became it became deeply uncomfortable because you felt, is this a farce? Is this a tragic comedy kind of form of criticism, or is this a real attempt to address such a total entanglement of ethical issues like the closure of Manifesta 6 in Cyprus was as well? So my question I would like to end with, because I'm not sure if it's a statement, I doubt about it, it's like, do we need a kind of, instead of just having a code of ethics that we perform, that fosters an ethical attitude in curating, do we also need a deontology that is binding and that is kind of guarded by a tribunal? I leave that up to the room and the panel to discuss.